The Unconventional Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Dave. We are the Unconventional Therapists. I'm here with my co-host, Greg. And today we're here to talk to you about life, living, and mental health.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
not?
yeah. I mean, sometimes I wonder if we're talking about mental health anymore after like 100 some odd episodes. But yeah,
It's
no,
psychology. I think
Yeah.
like psychology always is in everything, though. Right?
that's the thing. That's the beauty, right?
Yeah, we didn't even have to we don't even have to look sometimes.
No, I know.
Greg,
I
how was
can ask you a
Father's Day?
psychological question right now. Oh, how was my Father's Day? Thank you, Dave. It was really good, actually. I'm pretty sunburnt.
Yep.
But we hung out, we grilled, we did all those things that dads do, lifted weights in the yard. Like,
Lifted weights in the yard.
yeah, a la, Boys in the Hood, like
a
you mentioned.
la prison.
Yeah, I love prison too. I got that prison look to me.
Mm,
I know.
Until you actually get to prison.
Yeah, that's true. That's like when people used to say those Chrysler 300s used to look like Bentleys, and then it's until you've seen a Bentley, doesn't quite look like that. But Dave, in terms of psychology, I can ask you a psychological question that relates to this.
Oh, cool, Greg. My Father's Day was good as well. I had a great weekend. Thanks for asking. Go ahead with your psychology question.
Okay, well, sorry, Dave. I care.
Yeah.
Are you claustrophobic?
It's none of your business.
Probably
How's that for an
not.
answer. I'm not going to answer. That's HIPAA.
Why is that in your file?
Damn it, Greg. I told you not to talk about personal stuff on this podcast.
Yeah. Wait, so is that as if to say almost like kind of on some level everyone is?
I just don't want anyone to be able to identify me when they see me in public.
Or if they find you, you don't want to be able to put you in a little box and know your worst fears
Yeah, exactly.
and exploit them.
If they see me freaking out in an elevator, like, oh, that's Dave.
So an elevator, huh?
That's definitely not Greg.
Yeah. So today, Dave, we're going to talk about like a horrific ordeal. Also a testament to human resilience, though. It's going to be a story about the darkest manifestations of humanity. An act so evil that it could only be done by humans. Isn't that kind of ironic? Like other animals don't do such evil things like we do, but we are capable of some horrific atrocities, right?
Lions eat their children.
Dude, still, that's not as bad as this.
Lions eat their children.
I feel like this is worse.
All right. What if like eating their children was involved with this? Would you then say it was?
Well, what's worse about this, Dave, than eating your own children is that it's the length, the disregard for humanity, just the unparalleled trauma that these people felt through as they were going on this transatlantic journey, through hell. Yeah, filled with despair and cruelty and trauma. And this is going to be called the Middle Passage. And when I brought up the Middle Passage, did you have anything that came to mind? Is this like sort of like a common phrase? Is this something that everyone knows?
Probably not. Although it did ring like it was like something that I remembered learning about at one point in time, but obviously wasn't like fresh in my memory. So when you mentioned it, I was like, yeah, that's a good thing to kind of dabble back into because it's been a while.
Yeah, what I'm hoping we can do with this is bring some weight back to that term Middle Passage and not just be like, oh yeah, it's that thing. Like, I want us to be able to kind of give this the reverence it deserves. This is like a really intense, dark topic, and I don't know, it should be known, right? Isn't that the whole thing lately? Like, people aren't learning all the history. I mean, I've been out of school for so long that I don't know what the hell's going on in the classroom.
You say they aren't learning about all the history?
Yeah, well, I don't think even us. I don't think that's a new thing.
I think today's argument is they want people to start learning what they consider to be the real history versus like the history we learned. So I think that's the argument if I understand it correctly.
Okay. All right.
And I think there's some value to that, but I also think that like I don't know, nostalgia was like, oh, I loved learning about Thanksgiving until I actually learned about Thanksgiving, and then all of a sudden it's not as great.
Yeah.
So and then the other point of this is obviously we are releasing this a day before Juneteenth. So obviously we wanted to kind of have a topic that I think kind of like plays into helping people with the understanding of slavery and all that it encompassed and how horrible the conditions were, and the actual trading of people, quote unquote. So this is obviously just a piece of that puzzle,
a very small piece, but it's interesting to kind of like get into this conversation though, because it's kind of, it's something that no one talks about enough, I think, right? Like but we do see, and that's what I mean. Like we do talk about it, but when we say it, it doesn't hold this like incredible weight that it should. And let's get into it a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about how it began, like really briefly, just because I mean, like we can't really talk about how slavery began because slavery is like as old as civilization itself. Like exploiting each other is just part of human nature. So we would have to start talking, ancient Greece and Romans and I mean Mesopotamia. We'd be talking, you could do hours and hours on that. But for this purpose, right? This is when slavery is starting to be used for the first time, actually. The idea of race as a manner of like self-deception to allow us to kind of do this despite having a moral aversion to it, right? Like this idea that these people are less than or not quite human, subhuman. This property. Is what
it's property.
Yeah, property. I mean, yeah, you're exactly right. So in 1441, the Portuguese, the Captain Goncalves took a couple of captives, and this is kind of like sort of an interesting anecdote because this you can see how this sort of was the catalyst for all of this.
Was it Gonsalves?
It could be. I mean, tomato. Listen, is it Charpentier? Is it Carpenter? It's Charpentier. All right, but I let people get away with a lot of stuff, and I'm sure Captain Gonsalves was of the same mind. So this he took a couple of captives. He saw them, and it was kind of a crime of opportunity. And then one of them happened to be a chief. And he said, listen, if you give me my freedom, I'm going to get you a bunch more people. And I'll also give you knowledge of the interior of Western Africa so that, you can get more people whenever you kind of want to, right? So this starts the removal of slaves from Africa, and it spreads like COVID, if you believe in that sort of thing.
See, we just got flagged on YouTube.
I was just gonna.
Thanks, Greg.
I was just
and
gonna.
Now nobody's hearing this episode because it just got flagged on YouTube.
Of course, we both believe in COVID. I've had it multiple times. I just knew that would make a little face on Dave, so I figured I'd get it in there. Anyways, the Portuguese were able to exploit infighting in the tribes. Like, for instance, this chief was giving information about other chiefs and their people. Because when you think of Africa, it's not like this one, homogenous group. It's just like the Native Americans, right? It's sort of the same situation where the Portuguese were able to exploit these tribes. They have all different languages. They all have different cultures. This is all very different, right? So as this starts to include more of Europe and the Americas, this loss of humanity that I talked about has to become necessary to perpetuate the slavery. So I'll give you an example, Dave. Like the self-deceit. Like you might think like, hey, if I went back in a time machine, I would definitely not do this. I would not participate in this. This is against my morality. But we remember when that idea that, the fact that the conditions that people were building cell phones were horrific. People were committing suicide. They had to put like suicide nets outside the building. Ironically, there'll be, when we talk about slave ships, there's suicide nets around those too. But people were having a really hard time making these phones. It was horrible conditions. But for us, they make life easier, just like slavery did. It makes it more economical, just like slavery did. And it's just kind of this inconvenient truth that this is happening to these human beings. So when you knew that about phones, did you know that was kind of going on? No? Well, I did. And I didn't give up my phone. So like, what does that say about me, right?
Well, when I just found out now, I just gave up my phone. So
I saw you just throw your phone in the trash, and I was like, that is commitment.
So
this guy's something.
It says something about you a lot. right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's interesting how we always want to assume that we would be different, and I hope that we would. And lots of people were, the abolitionists, some really brave people, but most people just kind of went with what was easy, and you know they try to distance themselves from it through like self-deceit, accepting that these people were somehow less than.
Right. So the Middle Passage was part of what the larger transatlantic slave system, correct?
Yeah.
And it's called the Middle Passage because it's the middle leg of this 3-part voyage, which begins and ends in Europe. So it starts with the first leg bringing cargo, such as like iron, cloth, brandy, guns, gunpowder, to Africa, and landing on what they call the slave coast, which was then exchanged for Africans, and then going to set sail to the Americas with their slaves, where they were exchanged for sugar, tobacco, and some other product. And then that ship was brought back to Europe. So the Middle Passage is aptly named because it is literally that middle passage from Africa to the Americas.
Right.
The length of that Middle Passage on ship kind of was dependent on weather. So it could last like I've read something like 20 to 90 days, depending on, weather and all that stuff. And, there were different types of ships, but there was also these massive like slave ships, quote unquote, that were, they were built for literally for holding slaves. And like, they started to consider the potential for riots and things like that. So they were kind of like developed with that in mind, to kind of like maintain control, I guess, of the ship.
Yeah, the ships evolved as interestingly, people have probably seen this image of the Brooks slave ship, right? It's kind of this like super famous image, and it has like the layout of the ship, and then it has all the people sort of like laying all around the ship on the bottom 2 decks, right? And it's like this, holy crap, look at how dense and packed in these people were on an 80 day voyage. It's incredible. But that ship that we also sort of see and have this horrific response to is a ship that was built after lots of government regulations to create a more humane space for the slaves to be held. I mean, so that's not even the worst of it. I mean, it's pretty intense. So Dave, should we talk a little bit about like who was selected as far as slaves and why, and what kind of like that was like?
Sure.
All right. So people are, they have the intel, the information. A lot of the times, unfortunately, like another dark truth of this is like people are being slaved, like Africans are being sold by other Africans. And, it's interesting in Africa now, there are a lot of talk, just like here, there are talks of reparations about the people who were, those families who were kind of in power and selling slaves to the Europeans, because the Europeans needed help, right? They couldn't just do this without the help of the Africans. So,
well, something I thought was interesting too is even in Africa, slavery was already existent. So there was there's this one famous individual that wrote a story about basically the experience in the Middle Passage, but his I'm blanking on the first name now, or I'm blanking basically on how to pronounce the first name. Olada Equiano, I believe.
Yeah, so Equiano is really good on the last name. I'll say that.
Yeah, so his family actually owned slaves, and they were of higher rank, I would say, within their Igbo tribe. But even with that, they were still at risk of becoming slaves themselves, which ended up happening to him.
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring him up. He has this, and it's funny that I say the word interesting because he names his book "The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olario Equiano," if I'm not even saying that right. But he also goes by the name Gustavus Vasa, which is almost like a kingly name, which is something that the sailors and even the slave owners would do when they got slaves. They would kind of like name them like Caesar or like give them names like that, sort of like ironically, which is really messed up. But there's some accounts that say that Equiano's story may not be true. Am I stealing your thunder on that?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. There was because he was like 14 at the time, so
Yeah.
for him to be able to recollect all, or he was 11 when he was held captive, but I'm not sure if they felt like maybe he penned this when he was 14, but then there were like some of this his recollections felt like maybe they would be from like his parents describing these events to him.
Or even
S
other people. I mean, but whether it's true or not kind of isn't really that important. It's like super useful,
yeah.
like Frederick Douglass's
Well, he
narrative.
was, I mean, yeah, and he was a big abolitionist, so
Mhm.
he played a major part in kind of helping expose these conditions and bring humanity to the situation. So, I mean, kind of getting ahead of ourselves because we haven't even described
Yeah.
essentially who's there. But yeah, so I mean, it's you know, this person was able to describe some of the experience even prior to even being on the ship of just like that fear of what it's like when they're captured.
Hmm. Like you could imagine like sitting in your house right now, wherever you're listening to this on the treadmill or whatever, cutting the grass, and like out of nowhere, you're ripped from that. You're ripped from your home. You're separated from your family. You're placed with others who don't speak the same language, so that creates this difficulty for you to plan and to do anything. Um, you're you're a parent. You're not able to save your kid. You're just thrown into this horrific situation. Like, I mean, what could that have been like, Dave? Like, what is that? Can
Well,
you?
the thing I think is interesting is some of these people have never experienced another person that doesn't look like them. So for someone to come in with like light skin per se,
Mhm.
what like
I
what
know,
is
I know.
I was trying to like in my mind I was like this must be like what it would be like to be abducted by aliens because suddenly you're seeing this thing that like is it disguised like me but just looks very different or what is it, but like even being abducted by aliens I feel like would be less terrifying because at least we have this idea that aliens could or could not exist. So like if we saw one, be like, oh, that must be an alien. Or like if a zombie came running at me, I'm like, oh, that must be a zombie because
Yeah,
I
yeah.
know
There's
all
a
that. I have this like
like you.
understanding of what a zombie is.
There,
They have no
there's a level.
understanding.
There's a level here of like unimaginable horror, right?
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like you
So
didn't even know that was a possibility to be afraid of that.
exactly. It's like this thing that you never thought existed, and suddenly it's in front of you, and you don't know what it is. Equiano actually, there's a quote in his book said, "I asked if we were not to be eaten by those white men with horrible looks, red faces, and long hair." He thought they were going to get eaten. He had
Yeah,
no idea what their intention was. It's just, and then the other part of this is because of the way the Middle Passage goes, nobody ever returns. So not only even like let's say they weren't there, they, other people captured before them. They have no idea what's happened to them, so they assume those people like I'm assuming they must assume the worst, that like death or like you said being eaten. It's like people just
confusion.
go, they never come back, and you never hear anything. And I guess what some of the captors might say is like, oh, you're going to work on fields or whatever. And from my understanding, some of the African slaves were like kind of scoffed at that. They didn't believe it because they were like, their crops didn't need as much attention. They were
Right.
run without very little need for like significant manpower. So for them to be told that, they're like, no, that can't be.
Yeah, and the other thing you gotta remember too is so a lot of these people are from the interior of Africa, so they've never seen the ocean. So they see this
And
water, they see these ships sitting on the water, and they're like, it's another kind of level of that alien sort of,
well,
scenario.
and
It's like,
that's
what is that?
that's a good point because even with the conditions of how terrible that ship is going through the Middle Passage, just getting to that coast, they're captured, they're marched in chains for days to the ports along the West African coast. That's you can only imagine how many just died during that march
Right.
of exhaustion and whatever else hits them.
Yeah, oh, and of course, they're going to be discarding people along the way too, like the old, the disabled, children in a lot of cases, which
Mhm.
is heart wrenching for the parents. Imagine not being allowed to, you know, comfort your child as you're being pulled away. I mean, women were important during selection because obviously the childbearing and, you know, they can create more slaves, a lot of sexual abuse. And we could talk about more of that when we talk about the conditions on the ships. Men and women were both, and when I read this, I was like, ew, it's kind of like really messed up. But obviously we kind of all knew that. But you know, when you think of the people in their naked bodies and like just these white slavers kind of grabbing and prodding at them and grabbing their muscles and seeing if they're strong and kind of pushing them around with each other to see if their bodies could hold up and you know, checking every area of their body, it's very dehumanizing and like they're instantly commoditized. It's a really dark scenario.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what do you want to talk about now? You want to talk about some of the conditions on the ship? Like what was it like on these things?
Sure.
All right. So I'm sure you can imagine, right? I'm sure you can put yourself there. You like groans, cries, chains, whips. And then you got to think about the urine and the mucus and the vomit and the excrement and all the disease, like the smell. I mean, Aquiano makes a note of that in his book too, like the assault on his nasal cavity or whatever he says. It's intense, rampant sexual abuse. But you know, the sexual abuse is interesting though because some of the women were able to kind of use the sailors' interest to maybe, you know, get some intel on the ship so that maybe they could, I don't know, create some revolts, which maybe we can talk about. Skin, their skins rubbed off by the unfinished wood that just all laying on the wood. You know, there's rats. I mean, you had people around you were dying. You're chained to them. I don't know. It's just. What can you think of anything else? How horrific that would be?
No.
It's
No. So, I mean, just to give people a visual of like what this ship would look like. The living quarters is this deck within the ship that's like it's less than 5 feet tall, right? And it's throughout a large portion of the deck. There's these sleeping shelves that are cut with also a limited amount of headroom within that, and then you're stuffing about 300 to 400 people in this tiny area. So picture it being like you're ducking over or you're having to sit the entire time and you're basically piled in there with hundreds of other people. There's very little ventilation, so you can only imagine what the breathing conditions must be like. And there's not even enough place for buckets to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
So as you can imagine, disease is super prevalent, you know, passing around. Equiano has a good quote. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. Yeah. This produced copious perspiration so that the air soon became unfit for respiration from a variety of loathsome smells and brought on sickness among the slaves, of which many died. That just sounds horrendous.
Yeah. I mean, just those tight, cramped, like the fear. I can't think of anything. I can't think of anything more horrifying. I really can't.
The smell, and this is like, this almost sounds fake, right? The smell was so notorious on these slave ships that sailors often detected them nearby vessels, not from the sight, but from the odor, which the Atlantic winds carried for miles. Apparently.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that at all.
That's insane.
And it's amazing, like the resiliency of like human beings and what people are able to withstand.
Well, speaking of that, so enslaved Africans regularly tried to free themselves from the ship. Revolts were common, especially while they were anchored, while they were still on the coast of Africa. So, as we mentioned before, that caused, you know, the shipbuilders and the captains to start to design and organize the sailing vessels to deal with, you know, that in mind, that there might be potential for resistance. So the captain and the crew were constantly on alert for signs of revolt. And when a mutiny erupted, the crew used extreme violence to suppress the African captives. Those who rebelled were savagely punished by the crew, and the ringleaders were usually killed in front of other Africans and then tossed overboard for the sharks. Just like a total lack of treatment of like being human. It's like you are just a problem. You're either for my profit or you're a problem to me, and you're done, right? There's no like, wow, this must be really tough for them. So like, I can understand why they're acting like this. It's like, no, we're going to control them completely. Really, really sad.
And these revolts, it's like you got to think about it in terms of like how disheartening the majority of the people have to be, so they lose motivation. So like sometimes a few people would try to revolt, right? But since the other spirits are so broken, it just kind of leaves them hanging, and so their courage gets sort of punished.
Yeah.
There's also this thing that we've seen in our own personal histories is there's this idea of fictive kinship, and it's this thing where like even though these were like warring tribes and they put them all together and kind of mismatched them so that like they can't speak the same language, they can't sort of coordinate. There is this idea that like like if you think of the LGBTQ community, the immigrant communities, and et cetera, like there is these groups that they get together, and because they have a common enemy or a common cause, like they can all kind of work together. And so that's why some of these revolts were successful. So that's like one light in the whole darkness of this that I was able to find, that it suggests that if people can work together, if they have a common cause. Like I'm sure you remember, Dave, 9/11, right? And it's like we all had our differences then. And I mean, it turned into kind of a hate thing too. But we all had our differences, but we kind of put that all down. We're like, oh, well, like it's important, and we're together now. Like we're a unity now. So I think that it brought like a closeness and like a brotherhood and a sisterhood that healed the warring tribes. But I mean, at what cost? I know, but it's just it's interesting that it's possible that we could all sort of, despite being very different, thinking we hate each other, if we had common cause, we could kind of join together and like see each other as like brothers.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that's very important to remember is like the slave traders are viewing every individual on this ship as human cargo, right?
Yeah.
Each individual on this ship has some form of monetary value to them, and they don't want to lose anyone. So like, actually, a lot of their like punishment, their torture behavior is to prevent losing others, right? So the idea is, if I like sacrifice this individual who was revolting, who was a rebel, who fought against us, then the hopes is the rest of them won't, and I don't lose anyone else. The reason why I bring that up is actually like some individuals would have rather have committed suicide than continued this voyage. And the ship did everything they could to prevent people from being able to do that. They did not want anyone to commit suicide. They didn't want anyone to die. Their goal was to bring every individual there uninjured, if possible. They even like had the males do exercise on the deck once in a while to kind of keep them strong, I guess was the idea, right? Granted, they were shackled, and it was like for very limited amounts of time, and the majority of their time was spent in that that lower deck, crammed together. But there was this really interesting idea that like they were just viewed as product, and they were able to somehow, like the slave traders were somehow able to completely remove any sense of like feeling like they were they were dealing with other human beings. It's just a really fascinating mindset to like think about, like, how do you get to the point where you can view another human and have zero feeling of like, I don't know what that would be.
Regard? It's interesting that you say that, like bringing the people up onto the decks to kind of almost perform for them, because there's this historian, Jermaine Fowler, not the actor, but he's did a lot of sort of writing about different parts of the slave's journey, and he talked about how maybe this is the catalyst for Black people in entertainment, Black people in sports. Like, was this the sort of the genesis of that, bringing them up to the top of the ship to perform for the other people? It's kind of like a dark thing to think of, right? But then again, like as you know, we find out later on through the slaves and their idea of music and their culture, that's like without that there is no American music, right? So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's dark though, and you know it's that trip that you're talking about. You're right. Like it's the purpose of it's not to hurt people or kill people. It's to destroy identity and to be as cruel as possible, but with limits on death. Like some people are gonna die, but you know, and any kindness. This is another thing too. Like any kindness was manipulation. Just like in bad relationships, it's like you treat someone like shit, you treat someone like shit, you treat them like terribly, and then you know you be a little bit nice, and they're like, oh, like it almost makes them now they're like grateful for that nicety, even though you've been horrific to them. There's a lot, there's a lot of darkness here.
Yeah. And you know, the unfortunate thing to keep in mind, this is literally only a piece of the journey. So beyond the Middle Passage, beyond these conditions, this individual that is now brought to the Americas, the New World, you know, to be a slave, has so much more of a journey to go.
Mm.
And that for some of them might be even just as bad torture. For others, it sounds like for Equiano, it sounds like Equiano, sorry. It sounds like he actually got lucky a few times with some of the locations that he resided at after. Sounds like some of them weren't as bad of a nightmare as you know as his Middle Passage ride, but for others, I'm sure that wasn't the case. And they get there and they're exhausted, they're you know depleted, they're weak, they're starving. So you know how much longer did some of them have after that? Even
I know. And then it's like it's almost as if the nightmare's just begun too.
Yeah, very much so.
You know, there's something interesting that we were talking about, like abolitionists, a couple of, you know, Equiano being one of them. You know, the Solomon Northup, the guy. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. He would be another one. Frederick Douglass is another one. Slaves who became abolitionists. But there's this guy. You know the song "Amazing Grace"? It's sort of connected to like
that guy was a slave owner.
Yeah, John Newton. So and the song is sort of about redemption and forgiveness, but it's like, I don't know, man. Like he talked about how, you know, he saved like a wretch like me, right? So he's appealing to God for like forgiveness and redemption. But I mean, he talks about the conditions on a slave ship and the way sort of some of the tortures that were committed on children. But he talks about it because he committed some of those things. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, he was a slaver for years. I don't know. Is there forgiveness? Do you think, you know, the person who wrote a song about forgiveness, do you think there's forgiveness for someone who engaged in those? I guess it's not for us to say.
It's not for us to give.
Yeah.
The forgiveness.
For sure. Yeah.
You know, I think over time you've heard stories of forgiveness being able to be given, or at least people being able to move on. So I think that, you know, I'm sure it's possible to some extent, depending on that person's journey and, you know, the people that they need to get that forgiveness from.
Yeah, no,
I think who is that person they need forgiveness from?
I don't know.
You know, it's interesting because, like, think about it. In some aspects, in a lot of situations, the forgiveness should come from the person that, you know, was affected.
Mm-hmm.
But when it's a societal thing,
yeah,
it's like, well, then who does the forgiveness come from? The entire community and like, you're never going to get an entire community's.
Well, I mean, you're like, so this is a Holocaust, right? It's a Holocaust. Yeah. And you just like the Jewish Holocaust, you can't, it's like an unforgiven piece of history. Like it can never be forgiven because that would take something away from it. That's why I think like this is another period of history where it's an unforgiven piece of history. And if you forgive it, you sort of take away the gravitas. And I don't think that's fair to do. Everyone who was involved in it's gone. So it could have never been forgiven. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't think that's something like no one can understand it really anymore. Right. I mean, of course there's slavery in the world in different forms to this day. But this, you know, race-based slavery, where you have human beings working for you, but you consider that money is like even in the Constitution is like the 3/5, right? 3/5 of a person. I mean, it's really dark. And speaking of the United States, so 400,000. You're talking about ships with average 400 people on them. 400,000 people. That's a lot of people that would be brought to the States, but brought everywhere else on slave ships in this same manner. 12 to 16, 12 to between 12 and 60 million. I mean, how many trips across the Atlantic is that of 250 to 700 people a pop? I mean, that's staggering.
Yeah.
So this isn't something like sometimes when people think of it, it's like, oh yeah, like that happened. They like brought like some people over in a slave. It's like, no, this happened over and over and over and over again for decades.
We see this all the time, not to minimize this or even the Holocaust, but like when we did our Romani episode, there was a Holocaust of Romani individuals, correct? Like that, right. Didn't we bring that up? Kind of like the never discussed, genocide of Romani.
Yeah, like 2/3.
And that's just one example of a thing that we never really discuss or we don't bring enough attention to. So the point is, yes, like slavery was huge here. It was big a lot of places, and it's like affected a lot of populations, and it's just something that hopefully this is something that we will always have in our history that we look back at and say, like, let's never go back to that point.
Yeah.
And that's the big hope.
That is the big hope. And I think so it's almost like us sitting here, it's almost like you can't imagine something like this happening again. And I guess we can just hope. But I don't know. We're human beings. We've done this before. I mean, things like if it's benefiting you,
yeah,
you know what I mean? People will turn the cheek. That's what happened during the Holocaust, right?
And I think we always have to look at it as though, like, all right, if it happens again, what form will it take? Because obviously it's not going to happen in the same exact form because we've already experienced that and we've already kind of moved away from that. But how could it happen in different forms? Or how could it happen in a way that like maybe we wouldn't catch on right away that like, hey, that's kind of unethical, or hey, we're not really treating this, this population of people like they're humans.
And of course, globally, there were people that were kind of auxiliary to this. They didn't like really realize this was going on. They were probably benefiting from it or participating in somehow like, just not directly connected to it. And I'm sure there are things, you take about like sweatshops, right? Or whatever they call those things. Like, I mean, there's things that we're indirectly participating in that people were kind of playing that same role with slavery. And it's amazing that the abolitionists really kind of stood up for this kind of thing. But again, a lot of the abolitionists, there was sort of economic reasons for them too on some level. Like people just kind of, it's kind of sad, but people just kind of always do what just benefits them.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and it's all about always trying to keep yourself in the best possible position you can. So there's always people under you and you're staying on top.
So a great representation of this, what we're talking about here is, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Amistad.
No.
So Amistad was a slave ship, and there was a revolt, and it was coming to the Americas, and this was during colonial times. This was probably, I mean, it was America, so this was probably like late 1700s, early 1800s. John Quincy Adams was a former president, but he was still alive because he was the lawyer that represented the slaves. It's like a super interesting story. And he got the slaves off because, based on the rules or our philosophy on the Constitution, right? Like, unalienable rights and, self-evident laws that we should be able to defend ourselves and take care of ourselves. And through no choice of their own, these people were brought onto a ship and brought here. And he got them freed. It was
spoiler alert.
That's an interesting story, right?
Spoiler alert.
I know.
Now nobody's gonna go watch Amistad because you just ruined it.
What about 12 Years a Slave? You've seen that? Really?
Yeah, I haven't watched it.
That's another good one. That shows. I think he is. He's traveled, and just the treatment and the separation and the anguish. And so the movies like that are important too, because you don't just say, we're not just saying, hey, look, they were taken from their families and this. It's like seeing, like sort of, it's like seeing this family that was like vested together, and then seeing the agony of them being pulled apart almost puts you in their shoes, and you say like, oh my God, like what would I be like if I was just immediately, like all of a sudden, like right now I'm just taken away from my family, or my family's taken away from me. It's like, holy geez, that'd be crazy. Like one of my kids gone, or watching me sort of lose all my strength in their mind from someone just kind of pulling me away. It's just really hard. Like I just been thinking about it a lot too. It's a dark subject.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is our episode on The Middle Passage. So hopefully this was able to shed some light into maybe an under discussed topic, and maybe we'll kind of push people to look into other related topics.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of them. Quick little fan mail we received a few days ago, like 4 days ago. So this one is, I don't know how to say that town in Louisiana. Houma, 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 Louisiana.
I don't know, but I know Louisiana didn't come out smelling like roses after all this.
So take that, fan mail.
Kidding.
Take that after you said something nice to us.
We love you though.
That was Greg. I really enjoy and benefit a great deal from your style. Thank you, and keep up the great work. Love it. Thank you so much. When I got that, I was like, you know what? That was short and sweet, and that made me smile. So thank you very much. And we're going to keep doing things in our style as much as we can, because that's all we know.
We're trying to pass, and
we're too old to do anything different.
It's not an intentional style.
No,
I've never heard anything I do called style. And she did say your style. So she's talking about.
How'd you know that is she, Greg? That was a little weird.
I don't know why I felt that. Doesn't matter. We love you no matter what. So yeah, that'll do it on this one. Dave is what are you up to for the rest of the night, Dave?
Hopefully gonna end the night on a good note. I'm gonna be watching the rest of the NBA finals and seeing if my Celtics can pull this off. But I'm not gonna jinx it by making a prediction. I don't do that. Okay. So I will just be enjoying the game.
Well, we're hoping the best for you, Dave.
Yes. So everybody, as always, if you want to reach out, find us on social media, any of the Unconventional Therapists on Instagram, X. Pretty soon we'll get up on the TikTok before it gets banned. So we'll see. And then if you want to support the show, we have a subscriptions page, which is part of Buzzsprout. So if you type in Unconventional Therapist Guide to Nothing, support or something like that, subscription, sorry, you'll find it, or there's a link on our Instagram, and utgnpodcast@gmail.com. Feel free to reach out if you want to reach out there, or do the fan mail on there's so many ways. Come on, you all know this. I say it every episode. So just reach out, please. And if you can please leave a rating and review, that would be so amazing. We've gotten so many over the past month or so that it's been just so great to see, and I do think that it really is helping the show overall, because I feel like it just keeps reaching more and more people, and that's because of things like that. So we really appreciate that, and thank you for listening. So everybody have a great night. We'll see you next week. See you later.